Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the other side of productivity, or what I call productivity cracks. Is increasing productivity always the best measure of progress? Now here we're comparing it because nothing works in a vacuum. Companies don't work in a vacuum. Governments don't work in a vacuum. They're part of an integral system of society. So how does that work out for us? Because if all we're looking at is these productivity measurements, we can output more and more for the same input, sounds fantastic. Let's kind of analyze this a little deeper, shall we? So there's a theory that a nation's productivity directly relates to the standard of living. Okay, that might be fair. Let's take a look about that. So we get some new innovations, we're able to increase our productivity, we get some economic growth, and then our living standards hopefully go up. Is that better? It's a different question. The living standards may go up, but is that better? That's something we have to ask ourselves. So we have different productivity growth that happens in different types of industries. So for example, growth in service industries is actually less than manufacturing, which probably makes sense because there's a lot of human connection factors, a lot of human touch, human labor involved in services, which is different than manufacturing where you can get economies of scale and you can automate a whole bunch of systems. And that changes the game on manufacturing where you can get a lot more widgets because you can get a machine to do it, right? So that makes sense. However, productivity growth has slowed quite a bit, and it's expected to slow for at least another 25 years, down to 1%, a little over 1%. The US productivity growth has averaged 2.8% from 1948 to 1973. But that still doesn't tell us much about how does that relate to our standard of living. So fundamentally, you should understand this. Just because we increase productivity in companies or whatever the business is, does not necessarily equate to a better standard of living, which also does not necessarily equate to quality of life. Don't confuse these three things together. And again, this is a larger context outside of just the business, because if it was just up, to the CEO and the execs, maximize productivity as much as possible. But there's some countries where they do that, and it's almost like slave labor, right? So you just have the same people doing things, but they're just working them to death. That's not necessarily a solution for a strong economy and a strong country. In fact, if you look historically over the data, if you notice from probably like the 1940s on up to probably about 1970, it's a little hard to tell on this curve, we were growing, 1979, we were growing on an average about 2.5% annually in productivity. And compensation was increasing at about 2.1%, almost keeping pace with that productivity gains. That is a healthy system because a lot of the productivity then is being seen not just by the investors, not just by the CEOs, not just by that group of people, but by everybody involved in the company. So the rewards were shared to the employees as well. That's why the compensation growth was there, because they were making that productivity. So why shouldn't they get paid more? That's an argument. If you notice what happened from 1979 to now, our productivity has gone up less. It's at 1.4%, but compensation, as you can see here on the graph, is completely lagging. What happened? Well, groups of investors and folks back in the 70s, 80s started getting into the mindset that everything has to go to the investors. You have to maximize the profit for the investors. And lo and behold, who paid the price for that? The employees. That was the third tier. And so when people talk about how wonderful things were in the old days, it's like, well, yeah, because people were getting paid their due, their fair share, their contribution. What's happened since then in the United States is they're not getting paid their fair share. They're getting cut quite a bit on their fair share. And all those productivity gains have gone into the investor class, in the executive suites. And that's a problem. It's caused what's probably now one of the biggest differences between the investor class and the high-end executives to the employees that we've ever had. And this inequity of compensation is a major problem in the United States. It's made it why things are not affordable for the most people in America. So this is a major problem, so that something as little as this productivity conversation we've had should be tied to compensation. You get an increase in productivity, most of that should be felt by everybody in the business, right? They're all contributing to it. Why not? It'd be great. And then some left over, yes, can go to profits too. And believe me, the people were just as rich back then. Now it's even crazier. We have way too few people that own way too much. And you can see it. We actually have loss of productivity in multiple states. Now, this was a percent change in 2022 because you have a lot of people who are no longer wanting to work with the company. The loyalty for companies to people and people to employees has like imploded, partially because they're not getting compensated well. And so you see employees moving around a lot, right? Or a lot of companies that just hire and fire depending upon things. Now, there are other reasons for that. I get it. That happens. But not all of them are that way. You see some states where they still have some productivity change. Now, with the advance of AI that's involved in a lot of these things, we expect for a lot of white-collar jobs to have productivity increase. Now, if that's true, and we're going to leverage that, there should be compensation increases as well, because you're expecting people to do way more, right, for the same amount of time. So just keep this in mind. If the standard of living is your major objective, quality of life almost never improves. In fact, we've seen in the data that it actually devolves because your dollar and the ability for you to survive, because expenses have gone up and inflation's gone up, you can't do it because you're not getting compensated for that. So, and this is from Zig Ziglar. I like this one. All right, that's enough for today. Thank you so much. See you in the next one.